starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone and welcome to the webinar today, an introduction and overview to the new ABAS 3. My name's Angela and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. We do have a fair amount of people logged in from Australia and New Zealand, so because of this you will be muted for the duration of the webinar. However, if you do have a question or a comment, please type them in at any time into the chat panel located on the right hand side of your screen. Today we'll be wrapping up at about 1:15, so we can try and get out and enjoy the day. When you do exit the webinar today, there will be a window that pops up that will take you to a short survey. The survey should only take about a minute or so and will help us to improve our webinars and ensure that the learning outcomes are met. So now I'd like to welcome Melissa Stevens, Consultant Psychologist for Pearson Clinical Assessment. Thank you, and over to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome everyone to the ABAS 3 webinar. So today, as Angela said, we'll be wrapping up a little bit early, and I guess the point of today is just to really get an idea about the ABAS 3. So I really want you to have some understanding, obviously, of what adaptive behaviour is, which is what we're trying to measure with the ABAS 3. And also look at why it is that we measure it, introduce the new materials to you if you're unfamiliar with them, or indeed if you do have access to them, to reacquaint yourselves with them. The ABAS 3 has been out for a couple of months now, so some of you on the line might actually be current users of it and have that in your assessment kits currently. And I also want to provide an overview of the intervention resources, which is something that's reasonably new for the ABAS, and hopefully will be a lot of, or provide you with a lot of information, particularly obviously in relation to interventions once you've done the ABAS 3 rating scores. So just as a quick, I guess, task for yourself, how would you define adaptive behaviour? So what sorts of skills, tasks would you use to describe this to someone who might not have an idea of what we're referring to when we say adaptive behaviour? So the way that we sort of think about it here at Pearson, and the authors of the ABAS 3 and the publishers of it, WPS, is that they're skills that are important to everyday life. So these might be tasks such as grooming, for example, brushing your teeth first thing in the morning and before you go to bed, paying for a parking meter, for example, so knowing how much change you need to put in to cover you for 30 minutes, for example, if it's $2.20 per hour. It might be cooking, so making sure that you're kept well hydrated and eating nutritious foods, for example. It might be work. So this lovely man in the bottom right-hand corner here, multitasking as we all do these days. And, it might just be general things. This is obviously not, we're hoping you're not going to be falling downstairs by any means, but, might be moving house, for example. You're able to do that, carting things around, those sorts of things. So they're really anything that's going to be important for you to be able to get on with your day-to-day existence. So then what's the purpose of the ABAS 3? There's quite a few, and those of you who have used the ABAS 2 are probably well aware of it. For those of you who are currently using the ABAS 3, you've probably already considered these in terms of why you might purchase it and obviously have subsequently purchased. For those of you who haven't yet used the ABAS, and perhaps you're using something like the Vineland, you might be using ACEBA, so the Arkenbach, those sorts of tools. If you're brand new to any form of adaptive behaviour assessment, then these are some of the things that you might consider when you're looking to use these particular assessments. So specifically, the ABAS 3 is designed to provide us with a reliable, valid, comprehensive and norm-based measure of adaptive behaviour. It runs through from children all the way up to adulthood, so it's cradle to grave, as we would call it, so from birth all the way up to about 90 years of age. Often we will use it in the context of diagnosis or classification of certain disabilities and disorders. Probably the most commonly used or the reason it's commonly used is in the diagnosis of an intellectual disability. So we're obviously aware that in the DSM-5, which was released in May 2013, that it does specify some approximate IQ scores. So you would generally use this alongside a test of intelligence, something like a Wechsler, Stanford Binet, Woodcock-Johnson, that sort of thing. And that in our diagnostic statements, or in the DSM-5 diagnostic statements, it's mentioned that at least one domain of adaptive functioning be insufficiently, to be sufficiently impaired to warrant ongoing support. It can help us to identify strengths and limitations in daily functioning, and these are ones that aren't always obvious to the people that are interacting with the individual. So, for example, they might not be obvious to, say, a teacher, for example, until you really drill down and ask them specific questions about the child's functioning. Or it might be a colleague at work of a client that you're working with who, again, unless you ask these very specific questions of, they don't necessarily will be immediately aware of what those strengths and limitations might be. We can also use it to monitor progress over time, and a little bit later I'll show you how you can actually compare or conduct a progress report, and also to evaluate function over multiple environments. So again, this is one of the key areas for DSM-5 diagnosis of an intellectual disability, for example, where it's looking at in one or more life settings. So it's really helpful to be able to have a range of different raters that we can ask, whether it's an individual who's old enough and literate enough to do a self-report, for example. It might be the parent of a child or a teacher of that child. It might be a work colleague or even a parent of an older child or even siblings, for example. So as I mentioned earlier, it does span the entire age range, so it's used with individuals from birth to 89 years. That's 89 years and 11 months, just a day before their 90th birthday. And of course, it can be used in a whole range of different settings. Probably the most commonly used ones would be in schools and our health clinics. It's used in hospitals, rehab, acute, outpatient. It can be used in community agencies, and also some of you might be working in residential facilities and using it with your staff to rate clients that are in that particular facility. So before I go too much into the actual details of the ABAS 3, I just wanted to talk about some statistics in terms of some diagnoses that we're seeing, and a reasonably common trend these days. So in the USA, we have 1 out of every 10 children under the age of 14 that has some type of a special need. So this might be something that's either physical, cognitive, or mental in nature, or it could be some sort of chronic or life-threatening illness. So that's 10% of the population for those kids under the sort of teenage years. So that's fairly high. Are we any different here in Australia? Well, not really. So 1 in 10 students in New South Wales in particular in their public schools are considered to be under the disability or special learning needs categories. And that's up to about 15,000 students with disabilities and 50,000 students with learning needs that are being taught mainly in mainstream classes across New South Wales. So that's a really high number of people who are requiring additional support and who might need these types of assessments to help us better understand what those individual needs are. If we look at autism, we can see over the past few years, or about 30 years, that there has been a rise and a fairly steep rise in the 2000s. And the projected prevalence of autism, again, it's projected to continue to rise all the way up to 2020. So it's a little bit frightening statistics, in my opinion, and it's obviously, you know, given their percentages, some of these might be in relation to increases in the proportion of individuals that are meeting the current criteria. So when we look at the changes in the DSM-5, it's really important for us to make sure that we are capturing those people who are falling within those categories. And if people have more specific questions around DSM-5, I do have some FAQs that we will send to you along with the handouts for this webinar. And sorry, I should have mentioned that at the very start. You will get handouts sent to you in a follow-up email. And just quickly, 1 in 20 they're predicting in terms of prevalence of autism in the US by 2020. So what do parents want if they are the parent of a special needs individual? So basically when they're asked what is it that they're after in terms of their child, for example, the main responses tend to be fairly consistent and focused around being less dependent on them. So they want their children to be more independent at, in areas such as their school, home, work, and around the community. And in short, really what they want is for those individuals to function as effectively as possible in their natural and social environments. So that leads us straight into what the ABAS 3 is trying to do and what we're trying to use the information for in order to assist that independence. So if you look at our website, this is the pearsonclinical.com.au website, there's a lot of information on the page, but the one thing that I wanted to draw your attention to is this user level. So all of our assessments, as you're probably all well aware, are restricted based on your qualifications. The ABAS 3 is a user level B. So that's generally restricted to individuals of the allied health field, so for example psychologists, occupational therapists, speech pathologists and the like, and our special education individuals. You'll also find information on items and pricing, although I do have a slide at the end that will give you an overview of some of the basic and common or complex features of the assessment. There's some technical information if you're wanting to have a look at that. Under our resources tab, we actually have some sample reports which are derived from the computerised scoring, so feel free to have a look at those. You can download those as PDFs. And there's a webinar section here. So this is where many of you might have actually joined, so registered for this particular webinar. And we hope to have, in the not too near future, a link through your accounts page on our website that will allow you to access a list of webinars, most of which are going to be pre-recorded or recorded as we're doing them live like we are today, for you to access at a later time, or indeed to let your colleagues know who might not have been able to attend today. So a few of the revision goals, these are reasonably standard revision goals for most of the assessments that you would be using and that have been updated, but certainly the main reason that we tend to update these tools are that they are in wide use throughout the world. And they're really very well established in terms of doing what it is that they're doing. So in this instance, measuring that adaptive behaviour ability. Of course, the biggest update is normally around our normative samples, so we want to make sure that the normative sample that we collect is representative of the population. Now, this test is a US test. We do not have local norms, so it has not been normed or standardised here in Australia or New Zealand. Do we expect that there would be a difference? Probably not. Certainly what we're finding with our IQ and other assessments is that we're getting closer and closer to the US. I don't know, again, if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but fundamentally what it's suggesting to us is that there's not really a big difference in a lot of those other areas that we're measuring, so IQ, academic achievement and the like, and so there's not really anything that would suggest to me that adaptive behaviour would be a whole lot different to the US either. Of course, we look at additional clinical scales if they're needed, and those are added as warranted. Again, a big thing that we look at is updating and modernising the items that are included in there, and of course getting rid of any that are considered archaic and including any new items as necessary. And really to improve upon the previous edition, so that was the ABAS 2, we need to consider developments in the field of adaptive behaviour assessment, any professional reviews, and also really important for us is the user feedback. So what did people like about the ABAS 2, what didn't they like, and really looking at how we can improve it from the user's perspective, but to make sure that it's still going to be a really reliable and valid tool for you. And of course we need to look at the current standards as well. So the DSM-5, as I mentioned earlier, is probably the biggest shift that we've had in recent times, and probably that's used most often, particularly here in Australia. I think most of us, as psychs in particular, are trained on DSM-5 from a diagnostic perspective. But it's actually a whole range of different things that we look at. So the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Act, is consulted. The AAIDD, which is the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Difficulties, and of course the World Health Organization as well. So with all of those revisions in mind, what have we changed in the ABAS 3? So from a user perspective, the items for one skill appear all on the one page. They no longer go across the pages. So it's just a little bit cleaner, a little bit neater, a little bit nicer for people to complete. Of course, it also helps us. It allows us and simplifies for us the transfer of that data from one page across to another. There is a form-to-form comparison that's now available. I alluded to that earlier. So this now enables a comparison in 2 different environments or by 2 different raters. And again, I'll show you what that looks like. Currently available in pen and paper and hopefully due to come online shortly. Of course, again, I mentioned the intervention planner. So this has been improved. It is now available in hard copy. So in the ABAS 2, this was available, but only through the scoring software. But you can now buy a hard copy intervention planner. And again, I'll take you through this a little bit later. And it is available for all ages that the ABAS 3 covers. So birth all the way up to 89 years of age. And of course, we tend to modernise the look and the feel of the manuals and the forms, and again, I think they've done a great job with that. So some of the specific content updates in terms of items. Again, some of the things that we look at when we're reviewing these assessments is to make sure that we can accurately measure persons of higher and lower ability. So there were high difficulty items added for the 5 to 21-year-olds. For the self-report and also for the adult forms, and also lower difficulty items added for the younger age group to make sure that we're capturing what we would typically consider ID and IG, which are our disabled or intellectually gifted kids. Again, some inclusions of items that better assess adaptive skill deficits associated with 3 broad disorders, those again being ID, as I've mentioned, autism spectrum disorders. So again, we know DSM-5 made a shift from autism and Asperger's being separate entities to now being combined under the one autism spectrum disorder header. And ADHD. So these are the 3 that, again, we want to make sure that we're including specific items to better help us understand, again, the strengths and weaknesses of individuals with those particular disorders. We have had some item content updates, of course. So looking at the ABAS 2, which was released in the late 90s to currently, we've obviously had to keep pace with things like technology, which just moves, in my opinion, at an astronomical rate. References in items to newer technologies have been supplemented or replaced any references to older technologies. So just a bit of a snapshot, obviously, you know, where we used to look at movies on VHS and read the newspaper in print. Obviously now we have these wonderful devices like a tablet, and we can use things like Google to get our latest information. Again, for better or worse, I'll leave that to you guys to decide. So just an idea of some of the revised items. So here selects a television program or videotapes. So again, that's a little archaic these days. We've changed that to selects television programs or uses the internet. Has pleasant breath. This was obviously a challenging one to actually score or rate on. Attends work regularly, has been revised to goes to work at scheduled times. Again, just making some adjustments for individuals who don't work those strict 9 to 5 hours, or 9 to 5 times. Some of the new items that have been added. So engages in a variety of fun activities instead of only 1 or 2. So that's looking at, you know, tapping into ASD, for example. Stands still when needed without fidgeting or moving around. That's tapping in a little bit there to our ADHD children. Checks the accuracy of charges before paying a bill. And refuses gifts and rides from strangers. So again, probably tapping in a little more to our ID individuals in those ones. Some higher and lower items, so stays with parents and or family members in a store and does not wander off. Smiles or shows interest when he or she sees a favourite toy, so they're for our lower items. For our higher ones, is responsible for his or her personal finances, such as bank account, credit card or utility bill, and sends thank you notes or emails after receiving a gift or help with some important task. So overall, in terms of the item pool that's available across all of our forms, about 65% of the ABAS 2 items were retained, 18% were revised, and there are 17% of the items that are brand new for the 3rd edition. So a little bit of the same old, but certainly quite a lot of change. 35% of the items have obviously been revised and modernised, and brand new items included in that. Some updates based on user feedback. So the new ABAS 3 forms are easier to administer and score, so that's great. And the instructions are clarified on all forms by using the visual design so that respondents are better able to understand the distinction between ability and frequency. So that was nice feedback that we've received around those areas. In terms of specific cross-cultural item content, most of it can be considered cross-cultural. You may make some local informal adaptation if you need. So for example, if you need to change canteen and replace it with cafeteria. Again, what we're seeing though is that we are becoming a little more global in our language. I'm hesitant to say Americanized, but you can, if you need, make those minor adaptations if it's going to make it a little bit easier for the individual who's completing the rating form. So this is just a snapshot of one of the pages. This is our communication page from the parent form, and you can see that all of those items are on the single page. You can also see at the top here, it's a little bit easier to understand in terms of the ability, that is the person able to complete it? And then if they are, the frequency. So again, we've got 3 columns and 3 ratings for that. They've still maintained the guess checkbox if the person has had to make a guess in terms of whether the person is able to, and if they are, at what frequency they can complete that particular task. So some points in terms of administration. As I said, it's fairly easy, so you saw that 4-point scale briefly before. 0, as I mentioned, is the ability rating, that is the individual is not able to complete that task, or is not able, whether it's physical, cognitive or other limitations. If they can, the user then makes a 1, 2 or 3 rating, 1 being never or almost never when needed, 2 being sometimes when needed, and a 3 being always or almost always when needed. Now to complete the forms, this is obviously just an overall average, but it's approximately 20 minutes administration time per form. The table you see in front of you here is provided on each of those forms that you provide to the individual filling out the questionnaire. So again, you would go through this as part of your administration. Some of you might not be doing it face-to-face, so if you aren't, some reference to that the individual can read would be helpful, just so that they know really what's expected of them when they read through it. So again, this is to help the person who's filling out the questionnaire to understand what our ratings mean. So that 0 that is not able, for example, the individual cannot perform the behaviour. Perhaps they're too young to have even tried the behaviour. Maybe they don't have the actual skill necessary to perform the behaviour, or indeed they might not have been taught how to do it. And it might be that they have some limitation that prevents them, as I mentioned earlier. For a 1, which is never or almost never when needed, so they can perform the behaviour, but in this instance they never or almost never do it when required. They do it but not without being reminded. Sorry, they never or almost never do it without being reminded. Another person does it for them, or in fact that they refuse completely to perform it. So this might be our teenage kids that, they know they've got some homework to do, but in fact they're refusing to actually do it. It's not that they can't, they just don't want to. Getting out of bed in the morning might be another one, and maybe might not just be restricted to our teenage children. For a 2, which is sometimes when needed, you're able to perform the behaviour here, but the individual only does it sometimes, or sometimes they do it without help, but sometimes they might need a bit of help. They sometimes do it on their own, but sometimes they also might need to be reminded. And our 3 rating is always or almost always, and this is when the individual performs a behaviour and does it most or all of the time without help or without being reminded, and that they display the behaviour at a younger age, but perhaps now that they've outgrown it and so therefore they no longer do it. And there's that checked box again, just a reminder for them if they've taken a guess or an estimate, if they perhaps haven't had an opportunity to see the individual perform the behaviour, or in fact maybe they've seen the individual perform similar behaviours but not the specific one being asked on the actual ABAS form. So hopefully that just makes it a lot easier for the individuals completing the questionnaire to understand what our ratings are, and it increases the inter-rater reliability by providing more specific information about what those ratings reference. So there are 5 separate rating forms and they're all colour-coded. They're the same colours but look a little bit nicer and a bit more modernised as the ABAS 2. So if you were previously using the green form for adults, for example, it's still the green form. It just looks a bit prettier in my opinion. Just be mindful that they do require a 6th grade reading ability. So for a self-report, be very mindful of that. But if you are asking individuals to rate it, let's say parents, for example, and this might be in particular in low SES areas, or even individuals currently who are non-English speaking, for example, parents of refugees and the like, that it would require, if they are to complete it, a 6th grade reading ability. Now you can, and there is some, I guess, modification that can be made, and again I've got some information in our FAQs that relate to interviewing, so using it as an interview tool. So if people do have specific questions around that, then perhaps have a look at the FAQs and then contact me directly if necessary, if that hasn't sufficiently answered your questions. But as I said, there are some modifications that you can do it in a sort of, I guess, reading it out. Semi-structured interview, a little bit more complex, obviously because you're changing the format of the items or the format of the administration. So again, we just need to be mindful that the norms don't necessarily quite capture that particular administration style. In terms of the way that they're broken down, it is by age and setting. So you can see the second column here gives you an outline of the years of the individuals and the setting in which they might be used. So traditionally speaking, they tend to be used, particularly the parent ones, in the home or community. If we're talking school or daycare, childcare, kinder, that sort of thing, it would be the teacher, one of the 2 teacher forms. And of course, as I mentioned, the adult can be completed by a range of different individuals. So the adult one could be completed obviously by the individual themselves, but it might be their family member, could be a professional caregiver, any supervisors, work colleagues, a whole range of individuals. And I'll talk a little bit about who you might like to ask in terms of seeking their ratings from. So there are 10 specific skill areas in the ABAS 3. And if you've used the ABAS 2, these are pretty self-explanatory and consistent with that. So the first one is communication, community use, and functional pre-academics. I'll show you how they're organised in a moment into the 3 adaptive domains. Then we have home or school living, health and safety, leisure, and then self-care, self-direction, and social. Now, for individuals who are employed, we also have a work skill area, and for very young children we have a motor skill area as well. So they basically look like this once you break them into those 3 adaptive domains. And these 3 domains, the conceptual, social and practical, as you can see in teal at the top here, are the 3 that map directly onto the DSM-5 criteria for an intellectual disability. So as I mentioned, I was just going to briefly talk about how we select our respondents. And really what we're wanting them to do is to have had contact with the individual that meets these 3 criteria. One, that they are frequent, that is that they see them almost every day, and that would be true of our teachers, for example. That contact has been recent, so during the past few months, not 12 months ago, for example, or 3 years ago. And that it's reasonably prolonged, so that is for several hours each day. So if it's that your child, you're doing this on a child in a school and you're thinking of asking the geography teacher, but the geography teacher only sees the child for 2 hours a week, then we wouldn't suggest that they're the most appropriate respondent in that instance, and would consider that someone else, or ask that you consider someone else to do the rating. Perhaps the English teacher who might see them for several hours a week. Maybe there's a year level coordinator who sees them more frequently. So, it's sometimes hard to know who is best to ask. The other option you can do is to split the form across raters, but what we would recommend that you do in that instance is to have one rater complete an entire section. So if you remember back to the page that I showed you from the form that looked at communication, then you might ask the English teacher to complete communication, and then perhaps you might ask the PE teacher, for example, of a very young student to do the motor scale, because obviously the English teacher is going to understand and have more observations of their communication, and the PE teacher is obviously going to have more observations of their motor skills. So that would be an example of how you might split it across raters, but each teacher would do each section. In terms of scoring, pretty straightforward. These are metrics that you're very used to, obviously, and are consistent with a lot of other tests and standardised tests that you'd be using. Age-related normative scores are provided for the 4 domain composites, so they're the conceptual, social and practical, as well as the overall general composite, so the general adaptive behaviour composite. These all have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15, and are the same interpretation pretty much as what you would use when looking at an IQ score, for example. The 10 skill areas are scaled score metrics, so these are the same generally as our sub-tests in those big key areas, and these have a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3. Age-based percentile ranks and age equivalents are provided, but only up to 22 years of age, so just be mindful if you're working with individuals above that age, you won't be provided with age equivalents. And there are descriptive classifications provided for you as well. So in Australia and New Zealand, we have 3 options in terms of our scoring. A lot of people are probably, if you're using it currently or used it previously, are doing pen and paper. So our paper pencil administration, otherwise called hand scoring, so that obviously doesn't require any additional materials in terms of technology. We do have a desktop scoring software. This is compatible with Windows. And at this stage, I'll say only up to Windows 8 at this stage. We have not yet tested it on Windows 10, so if you're currently running that platform, stay tuned. And there is the online evaluation system that's available now as well. So this is through the WPS portal, WPS being the publishers of this test. Pearson only distribute this assessment. We don't actually do the publication of it. So lots of different options for you, and really you choose the one that's going to best suit your needs. Again, all pricing can be found on our website under the Items and Pricing tab. This is an example of the front cover of the parent form. This would be what it would look like if you had hand scored it, for example, although obviously it would be handwritten. It's typed to you just for simplicity of reading. We're fairly familiar with hand scoring our tools, I dare say. You can plot the different scales and domain scores on a graph so that you have some visual, idea of where their strengths and weaknesses are. You can computerise score it, as I mentioned. This is an example of the scoring software. And in that scoring software, there are a range of different reports that you can run. There's an interpretive planner report, an intervention tips report, and a respondent report. In the intervention planner, you select or deselect those that are going to be relevant or not relevant to the individual that you're working with, and they cover each of those individual 10 skill areas. So you really can target it specifically towards the individual. As I mentioned, there's a progress report. So if you have done this over time, there is a specific report that you can run. And you can select up to 4 different reports. So you might have done one at the start of the year, perhaps you've done some intervention, or there's been some one-on-one work or classroom work, or in a workplace setting, maybe the manager's put in place some skills and some strategies to work on some of those specific skills. So you can put in 4 different forms and you can actually run the report and see where that individual has shown any change across those 4 ratings. If you do want to compare 2 forms, as I mentioned, currently these are in the hand scoring edition and will be updated both in the desktop and online platforms. But currently you can use this particular form, and it's available via our website, or contact me if you don't have access to it and I can send you a link. And basically what it allows you to do is to see whether there's any significant differences between rater 1 and rater 2, in this instance the parent and the teacher. And what you can see is that it really just gives you at a 0.05 probability level a quick snapshot of where it is that those differences have occurred. So in this instance there's a slight difference in the parents and teachers rating of social domain, and also, if my pointer's working, here we go, functional academics and social. So just a quick note on intervention and program monitoring. So there are differences at the item level that are important for planning. So remembering again what the 0, 1, 2 and 3 represents. Basically what we can say is that if the individual has been rated as 0, they have an activity deficit. Whereas if they've been rated a 1, it's considered a performance deficit. So they have the ability to do it, but they actually just, for whatever reason, are not performing it. If you have a rating of 3 for any of those items, we would consider that the individual has actually mastered that particular skill. And so those help in us in, I guess, identifying where and which skills we need to target. So the first step would be to identify what those skills are and what the performance levels are that are needed, both not in their current environment, so usually where they are currently rated, but also if they're transitioning to any new environment. So if you're working with kids that are in grade 6 and transitioning to high school, for example, that might be quite a big change, and we need to consider some of the differences in the new environment to help them with that. If you're dealing with individuals, for example, who are returning to work after an accident, again, we need to consider what skills or performance levels they might need in that return to work instance. Step 2 would be to identify their current strengths and weaknesses, and that's obviously where we would look at the specific ratings on the ABAS 3. We would then want to identify and prioritise any intervention objectives, and again our intervention planner directly maps onto each item level and gives you a range of different activities that might be useful in terms of some of those objectives. Step 4 would be to implement those interventions, hopefully to achieve some sort of specific outcome or specific objective. And last step would be to monitor that implementation and, of course, looking at the effectiveness of any interventions that have been put in place. As I mentioned, the ABAS 3 Intervention Planner is a nice companion resource, and it does link specifically to any deficits that are identified in the ABAS 3 item by item. So it looks a little bit like this. So for example, under communication, item 1, this is for our littlies, of course, here, says the names of other people, for example, mama, dada, or the names of friends. And again, some of the intervention activities, if they're not doing that, is to point to or show pictures of family members to the child, any friends, teachers, daycare providers, etc., that they should know. Say their names, ask him or her to repeat the names after you. Again, encourage them to use the names of these people when he or she has them. Now, obviously, if there is a language disorder, we would want to do some sort of intervention on the language first. This is assuming that the language, so this is a rating of a 1, for example. They have the ability to say mama, but they're just not saying it for some reason. And again, it works its way through each and every item, and it goes across all of the age ranges. So as I said, this is for our very little children, but it works its way all the way up to individuals aged 89. So in terms of a quick look at standardisation and some brief technical properties, these are pretty boring, so I'll go through them fairly quickly. In terms of standardisation, there were nearly 5,000 individuals that were asked to complete this particular test and that were included in the final standardisation norming group, of course, ranging in age from 0 all the way up to 89. In terms of reliability, it's pretty good. So the general adaptive composite has a reliability depending on the form that you're looking at. So this is a range across all 5 forms. Even still, the lowest is 0.96, which is actually quite remarkable, all the way up to 0.99. So it's really doing very well. Test retest, a little bit lower and probably not unexpected. Here the interval was 3 weeks, so ranged from 5 days up to 7 weeks. It's more stable for older individuals, so they tend to be closer to that 0.89. For the littlies, obviously 7 weeks is a lifetime, and there's lots of changes that occur for little children across that time. So you tend to find that their test retest is a little bit lower, purely because they've done so much development across that time period. Inter-rate is pretty good. So moderate levels here, 0.81, but all the way up to 0.92. So for some forms and across some individuals, really doing again very well. In terms of validity, we have included in the manual some information around test content validation. There's a section on factor analysis, probably a good one to read if you're wanting to sleep at night. There's clinical group comparisons that might be of interest to you, remembering that again these are groups and that individual differences tend to be averaged out, but it does give you a good overview just in general about how these individuals perform in relation to these particular skill areas or how they're rated. And of course it goes through some equivalency with the ABAS 2 and some other key tools as well. So very quickly as an overview, the ABAS 3 can be considered as a versatile, comprehensive, cost-effective, relevant, clinically useful, easy-to-use, time-efficient test. It is currently the most up-to-date measure of adaptive behaviour. For those of you who use the Vineland and are considering, which one do I use, ABAS 3 or Vineland 3, we are expecting the Vineland 3 to be released around April, May next year. So April, May 2016. But if you decide to use the ABAS 3, here is the pricing for you. I will just go back quickly to the FAQs, but generally speaking for our Australian individuals, the kit, this is for the hand scoring kit, they start at $570. For the software kits, they start at $840, and for the intervention planner, it's $177. As I mentioned, there's also online scoring, and we sell those in batches of 5. So in addition to the FAQs that I'll send out, or that our marketing team will send out along with the handouts for this particular webinar, there is also an FAQ section in the ABAS 3 manual. So table 2.1 does have some frequently asked questions and answers in there. So hopefully combining those, and we will do a couple of live questions if there are any, but if you have both of those together, that should hopefully answer any questions that might come up in relation to the ABAS 3. So with that, I'll hand back to Angelie. I do want to thank people for their time, and I'll have her ask any questions if there are any. Back to you, Angelie, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks, Melissa. So I have just a few questions. I think we'll manage to get through just a few today. So I have a question from Lisa. What do you do with the old ABAS 2 performers?
Good question. So you can either use those up. Most people tend to do that because they're obviously quite costly. That would be my recommendation, certainly. If you're not wanting to actually use them and you're wanting to dispose of them, there are a couple of options for you. Usually what most people will do is use their internal locked recycling bin. So those are ones that are sent to a secure place for disposal. You can shred them. Obviously remember to remove any staples before you put it in your shredder. But generally, and you can, in fact, you can send things back to us if you're wanting to as well, if you purchased it from us. So we do a disposal program. And I can give you more specific information on that, Lisa, if you're after it. But generally speaking, most people will use up their pro formas prior to switching over to the 3rd edition.
Thanks, Melissa. So I have another question from Alistair. What are the items that are sensitive to ASD and ADHD?
That might be an easier one for me to get back to you directly with, Alistair, if that's okay. I don't have the actual forms in front of me, unfortunately, but you would have seen some of the items that I flagged as being new items specific to the ID, ADHD and ASD groups. Now, I'm not sure if that question might have come before that page, but I might get in touch with you directly about that, Alistair, and just see whether that question was met or not.
Great. I think we have time for just one last question. So I have a question from Natasha. Is there any research for use of the ABAS for people with substance dependence?
No, so they're not included in the clinical groups at this stage. Generally speaking, there's no reason you couldn't use it with that group, given that, look, all the norms are a quote normal norm anyway. They're not a clinical group. I guess the thing to consider would be when you would ask the individuals to do, if they're going to do a self-rating, when they would do that. So would you do that once they've been withdrawn? Do you do it while they're in the midst of their substance use, for example? I guess it really depends on what you're wanting to gather information on. Same probably applies for legal substances too. So if people are using legal medication and that, we know that's likely to have an impact on adaptive behaviour, are we better to get an idea of them on that medication or using that particular substance, given that's what their day-to-day life is like, or do we wait until they have had some sort of period between their former, the prior use? I don't think there's a right or wrong answer in that. I guess it's up to you to use your clinical judgment where you feel that might be best, when you would ask them specifically. Of course, you can always ask other people to do ratings of them as well, so you don't necessarily have to give it to the individual who's using that particular substance. And in that instance, you might get, I guess, better or clearer information in relation to their day-to-day behaviours. One thing to consider on the ABAS 3, and this is the same for all adaptive behaviour assessments, they don't have any inbuilt validity scales, so we don't have any idea of over or under reporting, and that's something to be mindful of. And it's generally where it's useful to get a range of different raters, or at least two, and particularly another one if you're dealing with someone with a self-report where you might feel that they have some inclination to over or under report, and you use that almost as a validity check. And again, that page that I showed you that allows you now to compare across two forms, that might be really useful for you to use in that instance to see whether or not there are any significant differences in terms of the ratings in those instances. Do we have one more, Angelique, perhaps?
Sure. So, sorry, just give me one moment.
And while Angelie's looking for another question, we will say that we will send out any unanswered questions to you. So again, have a look for that follow-up email.
Yeah, I have one last question from Deborah. How long does the adult version take to complete?
So it's about 20 minutes. Again, assuming that the person doesn't have too many questions or difficulty understanding it, but roughly speaking, most of them should be able to be completed by most raters in around about 20 minutes.
Great. So we'll just stop it for there. There was one or two questions that weren't answered, and as Melissa said, we will get back to you after the webinar. So thank you everyone for attending today. As I mentioned before, there will be a survey at the end when you leave the webinar. If you have a moment, please answer the questions, as we will use that to improve our webinars. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.